I think in this day and age, we're counting on rookies to play. I don't think you have the luxury of redshirting players, so to speak. I'm empathetic of that and understand that these are young players that want to put their best foot forward. It's not going to be perfect, but what we're not going to do from a coach's perspective is inundate them with all this information, and then we don't get a true sense of their talent.
Was there something wrong with Van?
Yeah, there was a miscommunication early.
They mentioned that you guys had the wrong plays in the wristband on the first 2 drives. Is that accurate?
No. Yeah. There was something, I don't know if the wristband got something on it or whatever.
Kevin Stefanski stepped up to the microphone for what seemed like a routine off-season press conference. Nothing earth-shattering happened. No controversial announcements. No shocking revelations. No locker room drama. Just a head coach talking about young players, development timelines, and the importance of evaluation. The comments were measured, thoughtful, and exactly what you'd expect to hear from any NFL coach during spring practice. Yet within hours, social media erupted. Debate spread across football forums. Sports analysts started weighing in. And suddenly, something that should have been completely forgettable became impossible to ignore. But here's the thing, this explosion wasn't about what Stefanski actually said. It was about what people believed those comments represented. Because for a large group of NFL fans, those innocent words triggered something deeper. They heard echoes of Cleveland. They heard reminders of old frustrations. They heard the same philosophy that had generated endless debates about player development, opportunity, and whether talented young players were being held back by caution disguised as patience. Falcons fans expected to talk about their roster this offseason. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a conversation that stretched far beyond Atlanta. The question became unavoidable. Had history already started repeating itself? To understand why Stefanski's comments generated such immediate backlash, you first need to understand the core criticism that has followed him throughout his coaching career. It's not complicated. It's not about one specific decision or one dramatic moment. It's about a perceived philosophy that some people believe prioritizes the process so heavily that actual results occasionally get pushed into the background. When Stefanski talks about patience, he's referring to something legitimate. Young NFL players genuinely do need time to learn complex systems, understand assignments, develop chemistry with teammates, and build confidence at the professional level. Nobody serious about football would argue against that basic fact. The learning curve in the NFL is steep. Rookies often struggle. Development takes time. That's not debatable. But here's where the disagreement begins. Critics argue that Stefanski sometimes uses language about patience, development, and evaluation in ways that can obscure simpler truths. When a young player starts performing well, when he's making plays and standing out in practice, when fans believe they're seeing evidence of readiness, that's when the conversation, according to critics, tends to shift toward discussion about long-term development rather than immediate opportunity. It's not that development isn't real. It's that critics believe the goalpost occasionally moves. A player shows promise, fans take notice, questions arise about why that player isn't getting more snaps, and suddenly the explanation centers on evaluation timelines and factors happening behind the scenes that outsiders cannot possibly understand. The implication, at least in the minds of skeptics, is that there are always reasons why talented players need to wait just a little bit longer. This criticism became especially pronounced during Stefanski's time in Cleveland. Fans watched young talent develop under his system, and while some players eventually thrived, others seemed perpetually stuck in a waiting pattern. Every time questions arose about why a particular player wasn't getting opportunities he appeared to have earned, the response tended to follow a familiar pattern. Patience, evaluation, development, details that fans cannot see. To coaches, this is simply how the profession works. They have access to information that fans don't have. They see mistakes that don't show up on highlight reels. They understand the complexity of decision-making at the professional level. From their perspective, refusing to make impulsive decisions based on public excitement is exactly what responsible coaching looks like. It's discipline. It's refusing to be swayed by social media narratives or one-week performance spikes. But fans experience this differently. Particularly in an era where information moves instantly and every practice clip goes viral within minutes, supporters have developed strong opinions quickly. They believe they know who's standing out. They believe they know who deserves opportunities. They watch a young player make plays and naturally wonder why that player isn't getting more snaps. When coaches respond with explanations about development timelines and comprehensive evaluation, it can feel like avoidance rather than clarity. What makes this dynamic particularly interesting is that both sides believe they're defending what's best for the player. Coaches genuinely believe patience protects young talent from being rushed before they're ready. Critics genuinely believe that opportunities, confidence, and trust sometimes matter more than another explanation about development. Both perspectives have merit. Both contain truth. But when those worldviews collide, tension is inevitable. The specific language Stefanski uses has become especially significant because it tends to repeat. He talks about drinking through the fire hose when young players absorb information. He emphasizes the importance of little details that coaches see but fans don't. He discusses how evaluation encompasses far more than what happens in practice or games. None of these statements are inherently problematic. Every NFL coach says similar things. But when a coach develops a reputation, every future comment gets interpreted through that lens. For supporters, phrases about patient development sound like wisdom. For critics, those same phrases sound like a warning sign of caution disguised as principle. And when Stefanski arrives at a new organization and immediately begins using similar language, people who remember the Cleveland debates pay attention. They're not necessarily saying his philosophy is wrong. They're wondering whether familiar patterns are already beginning to appear. This is where reputation becomes almost unfairly powerful. Stefanski didn't create the criticism that follows him. He didn't invent the debate about whether coaches sometimes prioritize process over results, but he has become associated with these conversations in the minds of many fans. And once that association exists, everything he says gets filtered through it. The real challenge is that reputations are difficult to change. If fans believe a coach is overly cautious, they will interpret new comments as more caution. If people believe a coach is focused on development above opportunity, they will hear patience when perhaps he's simply being thoughtful. If critics believe a coach is holding players back, they will hear excuses when perhaps he's explaining legitimate complexities. Fair or unfair, that's how human psychology works. First impressions stick. Narratives solidify. And every new comment becomes additional evidence in a case that's already been largely decided in people's minds. For Stefanski in Atlanta, this means the burden of proof is higher than it would be for a coach without this particular history. Every decision will be scrutinized. Every explanation will be analyzed. The reputation has already arrived before him. One name kept appearing in comments across social media after Stefanski's recent press conference, even though he never mentioned it. Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback who played for Stefanski in Cleveland and who has become the symbol of a much larger debate about whether talented young players receive fair opportunities or get held back by organizational caution. Sanders' name shouldn't have been relevant to Stefanski's comments about general player development. Yet it was. And that's the key to understanding why this story has exploded so dramatically. The Shedeur Sanders debate never really ended. Even now, long after he's moved on from Cleveland, people continue arguing about how his development was handled and whether he received the opportunities some supporters believe he earned. Every time Stefanski becomes part of a major football conversation, those old debates seem to resurface. It's almost as if the two stories have become permanently linked in the minds of certain fans. Whether that connection is entirely fair doesn't matter. It's powerful, and it's shaping how people interpret everything Stefanski does. For supporters of Shedeur, the frustration was never simply about one game, one practice, or one coaching decision. It was about a broader feeling that he was often discussed differently than other young quarterbacks in similar situations. Whenever questions were raised about opportunities, progression, or future roles, the conversation seemed to shift back toward patience, evaluation, development, and factors taking place behind the scenes. To coaches, those explanations were completely reasonable. To many supporters, however, they sounded like barriers that constantly moved whenever Shedeur appeared to gain momentum. This created a narrative that still dominates discussions about Stefanski's coaching philosophy. Critics point to Shedeur as an example of why they question his approach. They argue that talented young players sometimes need opportunities, confidence, and trust more than another explanation about development timelines. They believe there are moments when organizations can become so focused on caution that they fail to capitalize on momentum or recognize when a player is genuinely ready to contribute at a higher level. The fascinating part is that nobody can definitively say whether Shedeur was held back unfairly or whether patient development was genuinely what he needed. That's precisely why the debate continues. Supporters of Stefanski see a coach who was trying to build a quarterback properly, ensuring he had every tool necessary to succeed at the professional level. Critics see a coach who became so focused on development that obvious opportunities were missed. What cannot be denied is that Shedeur Sanders remains a major part of the larger conversation surrounding Stefanski's coaching philosophy. His name continues appearing in discussions that technically have nothing to do with him. Fans continue referencing his experience when evaluating new situations. Critics continue using him as an example when questioning coaching decisions. Supporters continue defending the importance of patience in quarterback development. The fact that his name still generates this level of discussion shows how influential those debates became and how strongly people still feel about them. Here's what makes this particularly significant for Atlanta. When Stefanski's comments about development and evaluation began circulating, a large audience immediately thought about Shedeur. Not because the circumstances are identical, not because Atlanta's young quarterbacks are in the exact same situation, but because critics believe the underlying philosophy sounds familiar. They hear the same emphasis on the process. They hear the same reminders that coaches have access to information the public does not. And for some fans, that instantly brings old frustrations back to the surface. This connection reveals something important about how narratives work in professional sports. A coach's reputation becomes shorthand for an entire philosophy. Instead of evaluating each situation independently, fans interpret new situations through the lens of what they believe happened before. It's not necessarily fair, but it's incredibly powerful. Stefanski could make completely reasonable decisions in Atlanta and still face criticism from people who believe his approach failed with Shedeur. The Shedeur Sanders ghost is particularly potent because it involves a quarterback. There's nothing more important to an NFL franchise than quarterback development. It's the foundation of everything. Fans care deeply about it. They watch closely. They develop strong opinions quickly. And when a coach develops a reputation for handling quarterbacks a certain way, every future quarterback decision will be evaluated through that lens. For Falcons fans specifically, this matters tremendously. If Atlanta has young quarterbacks who need development, Stefanski's approach will be scrutinized intensely. Fans will watch for signs that he's being overly cautious. They'll question whether young quarterbacks are getting fair opportunities. They'll compare his decisions to what other coaches do in similar situations. Some of that scrutiny will be fair. Some of it will be influenced by memories of Shedeur. This is the burden Stefanski now carries into Atlanta. It's not just about his coaching ability or his actual decisions. It's about fighting against a narrative that's already been constructed. The Shedeur Sanders debate created a template that fans will apply to whatever happens next. Every young talent development situation will be evaluated through that lens. Every patience-related comment will trigger memories of Cleveland. Every explanation about evaluation will remind people of previous debates. Whether this is entirely fair is debatable. But it's undeniably real. And it means Stefanski faces a unique challenge in Atlanta. He doesn't just have to be a good coach. He has to actively reshape a narrative that was created thousands of miles away and won't disappear simply because he changed teams. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire situation is how the exact same words can generate completely opposite reactions depending on who's listening. Stefanski said things about player development, patience, and evaluation. Some people heard wisdom. Others heard warning signs. Both groups believe they're interpreting the same comments correctly, yet they reach entirely different conclusions. For supporters of Stefanski, his recent comments represent exactly what responsible coaching should sound like. They hear someone who refuses to make emotional decisions based on social media pressure. They see a coach who understands that player development is complex and that organizations must think long-term rather than react to weekly performance spikes. From this perspective, the emphasis on evaluation is not evasion. It's professionalism. It's the difference between coaches who understand their job and coaches who get swayed by outside noise. Supporters point out that every NFL coach talks this way. It's not unique to Stefanski. Every coach discusses patience. Every organization emphasizes development. Every coach has talked about evaluating the complete picture rather than single performances. If you took Stefanski's comments and removed his name, they would sound completely reasonable to anyone familiar with professional football. The language is standard. The philosophy is mainstream. There's nothing controversial about it. In this view, the criticism is unfair. It's based on reputation rather than actual decisions. Stefanski hasn't made problematic choices in Atlanta yet. He's simply been a thoughtful coach during the offseason. Fans are projecting Cleveland onto Atlanta, seeing patterns where they want to see them, and creating controversy where none actually exists. From this perspective, supporters believe critics are reading way too much into routine coaching comments. But critics hear something entirely different from those exact same words. They hear language they believe has become associated with a coaching style that prioritizes caution over urgency. They hear explanations they feel are frequently used whenever questions begin emerging about young players and their opportunities. They hear the same phrases that appeared again and again during debates about Shedeur, about patience, about development timelines that always seem to extend just a bit further. From the critic's perspective, this isn't about misinterpreting innocent words. It's about recognizing a pattern. They believe Stefanski has a genuine tendency to focus so heavily on development that immediate opportunity sometimes gets overlooked. They think there are situations where talented players earn chances through performance only to be told they need more time, more development, or more experience. And they see those same patterns beginning to emerge in Atlanta. Critics aren't saying Stefanski is a bad coach. Many of them acknowledge his success and his knowledge of football. They're making a more specific argument, that his approach can sometimes slow down opportunities for players who appear ready to contribute, that his emphasis on patience and evaluation can become an obstacle rather than a tool, that organizations can become so focused on development that they fail to capitalize on momentum. What's fascinating is that both sides believe they're defending what's best for the players. Stefanski's supporters genuinely believe that patience protects young talent from being rushed before they're prepared. That development done correctly prevents injury and builds better players. That refusing to make impulsive decisions based on public pressure is exactly what young players need. They see caution as wisdom. Critics genuinely believe that young players sometimes need opportunities, confidence, and trust more than another explanation about development timelines. That momentum matters. That sometimes the best way to develop a player is to give him a real chance to play. That organizations can become so focused on process that they miss obvious truths. They see caution as hesitation. The problem is that both perspectives contain legitimate points. Player development is complex. Young players do need time. Coaches do have access to information fans don't have. All of that's true. But it's also true that sometimes talented players are ready before organizations believe they are. Sometimes giving a player a real opportunity is the best development tool available. Sometimes caution becomes an excuse. This is why debates surrounding Stefanski tend to be so emotionally charged. The disagreement isn't about facts. It's about philosophy. It's about how much weight to place on long-term development versus immediate performance. It's about whether organizations should prioritize protecting players from mistakes or giving players chances to prove themselves through experience. Reasonable people disagree on these questions, and Stefanski has become the focal point of that disagreement. In Atlanta, both sides are already positioned. Supporters are ready to defend his approach. Critics are ready to question it. Every decision he makes will be interpreted through these opposing lenses. If a young player thrives, supporters will point to that as evidence that patience works. If a talented player appears stuck waiting for a chance, critics will immediately argue that nothing has changed. The same outcome can support completely opposite conclusions depending on where you stand. This dynamic explains why his comments generated such a strong reaction. It wasn't about the words themselves. It was about the battle between two completely different interpretations of what those words represent. Supporters heard discipline and structure. Critics heard caution and hesitation. Both groups listened to the same press conference. Both heard the same quotes. Both walked away convinced they understood what Stefanski's approach would look like in Atlanta. The reality is that truth likely sits somewhere between these positions. Stefanski's philosophy probably has genuine strengths and probably has real limitations. But fans won't wait for nuance. They'll choose their side and interpret everything through that lens. And that's precisely why this story is only getting started. One of Stefanski's most talked about phrases from his recent comments involved the idea of focusing on little details. On the surface, it's a completely reasonable statement. To NFL coaches, those little details are often everything. Proper footwork, correct reads, understanding assignments, managing the huddle, recognizing defensive adjustments. These details can determine whether a player succeeds or fails at the highest level of competition. Any serious coach would emphasize this. Yet this phrase has become a flashpoint in debates about Stefanski's coaching philosophy, and the reason reveals something important about how communication breaks down between coaches and fans. When Stefanski talks about the little details that coaches see but fans don't, he's making a legitimate point. Coaches do see things fans cannot perceive from the stands or from edited highlight clips. That's not an excuse. That's reality. A coach can identify decision-making errors that don't show up in statistics. A coach can recognize communication breakdowns that viewers don't notice. A coach can understand assignment issues that look like something else entirely to the casual observer. The problem comes when critics believe this emphasis on details that fans cannot see sometimes becomes a barrier to opportunity. In their view, it's a way of explaining why talented players who appear ready according to external observers still aren't getting chances. The coach can always say there are details the public doesn't understand. The coach can always reference elements of preparation and decision-making that casual viewers didn't witness. From this perspective, focusing on invisible details becomes a convenient explanation that's difficult to refute. This creates an asymmetrical situation. If a player who's getting significant opportunities plays well, everyone celebrates that decision. If a player who's waiting for his opportunity plays well when he finally gets a chance, everyone debates whether he should have been given that opportunity sooner. But if a player is mostly sitting on the bench, the explanation about little details that fans can't see becomes incredibly difficult to challenge. How can fans argue against details they cannot perceive? A small incident during Stefanski's recent comments illustrates this dynamic perfectly. There was a miscommunication involving a wristband with plays during early practices. It was a minor mistake, the kind of thing that happens in every NFL training camp, but the way it was discussed revealed something significant. Stefanski explained it casually, noting that the wristband got something on it or there was miscommunication about which plays were listed. From a practical standpoint, that's a reasonable explanation. Equipment issues happen. Communication mistakes happen. Nothing unusual there. But for critics watching closely, even small explanations like this fit into a larger pattern. When things don't go according to plan, there are always explanations about details, miscommunications, or factors outside a player's control. From this perspective, the emphasis on factors fans cannot see becomes problematic not because any individual explanation is unreasonable, but because it creates an endless loop of explanations that always point back to complexity and factors outside public awareness. This is where the real tension emerges. Coaches genuinely do need to focus on details that fans cannot see. That's how you properly evaluate talent. That's how you build winners at the professional level. You can't make decisions based solely on what's visible in highlight reels. You need to understand preparation, decision-making consistency, communication, and execution details that show up on film but not in the public eye. That's completely legitimate. But when fans feel like the complete picture is always being discussed, while the actual conclusions remain unclear, frustration becomes inevitable. A fan watches a young quarterback make plays in practice and asks why he's not getting snaps in games. The coach responds with an explanation about details involved in the evaluation. The fan thinks that's reasonable, but also thinks that if the player is making plays, isn't that relevant information too? The disconnect creates tension because both perspectives are partially correct. What makes this particularly significant in Stefanski's case is that he seems comfortable living in this tension. He doesn't necessarily try to resolve the disagreement between his internal evaluations and public perceptions. He's content to explain that coaches see things fans don't, and that evaluation is complex. Both statements are true, but they don't necessarily answer the underlying question that fans are asking. Why isn't this talented player getting opportunities? For supporters, Stefanski's willingness to emphasize the complexity is refreshing. It suggests he's not going to make emotional decisions based on public pressure. He's going to evaluate comprehensively, consider details that outsiders miss, and make decisions based on complete information. That sounds like responsible coaching. For critics, that same willingness feels evasive. It suggests he's comfortable with explanations that fans cannot verify. It suggests he's content to let the conversation remain at the level of coaches see things you don't, without getting into specifics about what those things are or how they affect decisions. From this perspective, the emphasis on invisible details becomes a way of operating without accountability to public scrutiny. The wristband example is minor, but it's illustrative. Even a small miscommunication gets explained in terms of details and factors outside a player's control. Multiply that across an entire season of decisions, and you can see why critics become frustrated. Every decision, every explanation, every move back to discussions of evaluation and details. Never a simple answer. Always more complexity. Always more factors the public doesn't understand. This is the little details problem that has followed Stefanski to Atlanta. It's not that he's wrong to emphasize detail-oriented coaching. It's that emphasis on invisible details can become a way of insulating decisions from outside scrutiny. And when fans already suspect that a coach prioritizes caution, every discussion about details they cannot see feels like confirmation of their suspicions. Here's something that's often overlooked in discussions about coaching philosophy. Reputations don't just shape conversations. They fundamentally alter how every word gets interpreted. Once a coach develops a certain reputation, future comments get filtered through that lens almost automatically. It's not fair, it's not rational, but it's incredibly powerful, and it's precisely what's happening with Stefanski right now. If a coach without Stefanski's history had said the exact same things about patience, development, and evaluation, the reaction would have been minimal. Every NFL coach says similar things. It would have been routine. People would have moved on. But because Stefanski has a reputation for emphasizing development and patience, every word he says gets interpreted as evidence of that approach. The same statements that would be forgettable coming from someone else become significant when coming from him. This is the burden of reputation. Once people decide what a coach represents, they see confirmatory evidence everywhere. If fans believe a coach is overly cautious, they will interpret new comments as more caution. If people believe a coach is focused on development above opportunity, they will hear patience when perhaps he's simply being thoughtful about a complex situation. If critics believe a coach is holding players back, they will hear excuses when perhaps he's explaining legitimate complexities. The unfair advantage critics have is that the narrative is already established. Stefanski didn't create the criticism that follows him. He didn't invent the debate about whether coaches sometimes prioritize process over results, but he has become associated with these conversations in the minds of many fans. And once that association exists, everything he says gets interpreted through it. This dynamic is especially powerful because it's largely self-reinforcing. Critics are watching closely for evidence that confirms their suspicions. When they see it, they point to it as proof. When they don't see it, they assume it's happening behind the scenes in ways the public can't perceive. Either way, the reputation is reinforced. Stefanski could make the most player-friendly decisions imaginable, and if they result in young players waiting longer than some fans expected, critics would interpret that as evidence of caution. What's particularly interesting is that this reputation followed Stefanski from Cleveland to Atlanta without him having made a single decision in Atlanta yet. He hasn't had time to actually demonstrate his approach with Falcons players. He hasn't made controversial choices. He hasn't been involved in any situations that directly implicate the criticism. Yet the reputation preceded him. The expectation already exists. The narrative is already forming. This puts Stefanski in a unique situation. He's not being judged solely on what he does in Atlanta. He's being judged against a reputation from somewhere else. He's fighting against narratives created in Cleveland. He's being compared to decisions made with different players in a different system. The burden of proof is higher than it would be for a coach without this particular history. For supporters of Stefanski, this is deeply unfair. They argue that he shouldn't be punished indefinitely for decisions made in a different organization with different circumstances. They say that every coach deserves a fresh start and the opportunity to prove themselves based on what they actually do, not what people think they might do based on previous situations. For critics, the reputation is based on legitimate patterns they believe they've observed. They're not making up concerns. They watched what happened in Cleveland. They saw how young players were handled. They formed conclusions based on actual events. Why should they give Stefanski the benefit of the doubt when his previous approach raised real questions in their minds? Both perspectives have merit. But here's what's undeniable. The reputation exists, and it's shaping how people interpret everything Stefanski does. When he talks about patience, people think about Shedeur. When he emphasizes evaluation, people think about players who were waiting for opportunities. When he discusses details coaches see, but fans don't, people think about explanations they've heard before. The reputation lens also explains why this entire story has exploded so quickly. It's not really about one press conference. It's about what people believe that press conference represents. It's about whether those comments signal that familiar patterns are beginning again. It's about whether Stefanski is going to operate the same way in Atlanta that he did in Cleveland. This is why every decision he makes will be scrutinized so carefully. Every roster move will be examined for signs of the philosophy people associate with him. Every player development decision will be compared to what happened before. Every explanation will be analyzed for familiar patterns. The reputation has created a lens that filters everything. For Stefanski moving forward, this presents a real challenge. He can't simply coach the way he always has and expect people to interpret it the way coaching colleagues might. He can't make patient development decisions without facing questions about whether he's being overly cautious. He can't emphasize evaluation without people wondering if he's using it as an excuse to delay opportunity. The reputation has changed the context in which his decisions are evaluated. What this reveals is that coaching reputations matter enormously, sometimes more than actual performance. Fair or unfair, they shape narratives. They influence conversations. They create pressure long before games are played. Stefanski's reputation didn't create itself, but it's incredibly powerful. And in Atlanta, it's already affecting how every move is being interpreted. Usually when a new coach arrives at an NFL franchise, he gets several months before every single decision starts being analyzed under a microscope. There's a honeymoon period where fans give a coach the benefit of the doubt. There's time for the organization to establish itself. There's space for evaluation before the pressure becomes truly intense. But for Kevin Stefanski in Atlanta, that window is closing before it even fully opened. The reaction to a single press conference has accelerated the timeline for scrutiny in an unusual way. Falcons fans are already analyzing every comment, every explanation, and every hint about how young players will be evaluated. That level of attention this early is unusual, but it shows exactly how much curiosity exists around what Stefanski's approach will actually look like in a completely new environment. This heightened attention has a snowball effect. The more people are watching, the more significant every decision becomes. A depth chart move that would normally be routine becomes part of a narrative about philosophy. A young player not getting snaps becomes evidence of a pattern rather than simply a coaching decision. Every transaction gets interpreted through the lens of what people already believe about Stefanski's approach. What's making the pressure particularly intense in Atlanta is that the Falcons have invested heavily in building for the future. They have young talent across the roster. They have draft picks they're hoping will develop into major contributors. They have emerging players they need to take significant steps forward. This is an organization that desperately needs player development to work. They need young talent to flourish. They need fresh energy throughout the roster. Fans understand this completely. They know that the future of the organization will depend on how effectively young players are identified, developed, and trusted. That's why discussions about coaching philosophy matter so much in Atlanta. They're not just talking about abstract concepts. They're talking about the actual future direction of the franchise. They're talking about whether the team's long-term plans will succeed or stall. This is where Stefanski faces a particularly challenging position. Fair or unfair, many people already have strong opinions about how he approaches player development. Some believe his method creates stability and prevents players from being rushed before they're ready. Others believe it can sometimes slow down opportunities for players who appear ready to contribute. Those opinions existed before he arrived in Atlanta, and now they're following him into his new situation. The Falcons' commitment to youth development means that every decision involving young players will become part of the larger narrative. It's not just about one player or one situation. It's about whether Stefanski's approach is right for this organization's specific needs. Atlanta needs players developed quickly and effectively. They need young talent to prove itself. They need evidence that opportunities are being created for emerging players. For fans, the biggest concern is not necessarily about one specific player. It's about the overall approach. They want to know whether performance will be rewarded quickly. They want to know whether young players will have a realistic path to earning larger roles. They want to know how competition will be handled. Most importantly, they want to see evidence that the best players will ultimately find their way onto the field. These are not unreasonable questions. Every NFL team needs to address them. But they become even more significant when a coach arrives with an established reputation that people already feel strongly about. The questions don't change, but the context changes dramatically. Stefanski isn't arriving as a blank slate. He's arriving with a narrative already attached. This narrative will shape how every decision is received. If young players thrive early and get significant opportunities, supporters will point to that as proof that patience works and that Stefanski's approach is creating the right environment for development. If a talented young player earns a bigger opportunity, fans will debate whether it was deserved or whether it took too long. If a young player struggles when given chances, some will argue he needed more development time, while others will argue the opportunity came too late. The stakes are higher in Atlanta than they appear on the surface. Winning games always matters most in the NFL, but coaching reputations are often built on more than wins and losses alone. Fans pay attention to how players are developed. They pay attention to who gets opportunities. They pay attention to how organizations handle competition. Those factors shape narratives long before the regular season standings tell the full story. In Atlanta, those narratives are already beginning to form, and every move will either strengthen or weaken them. A young defensive lineman who gets snaps and makes plays will be seen as evidence of smart development. A young cornerback who looks good in practice but doesn't play in games will be seen as evidence of caution. Every decision becomes part of a larger story about what Stefanski's approach actually looks like. The unique pressure on Stefanski in Atlanta comes from the fact that expectations are already set. People aren't waiting to evaluate him based on actual results. They're watching for signs that confirm what they already believe. That's an incredibly difficult situation because it means success is defined differently for different audiences. Success for supporters means young players developing properly. Success for critics means opportunities being created quickly for talented players. The reality is that Stefanski now has a chance to write a completely different chapter. New team, new roster, new expectations, new opportunities. If Atlanta's young players flourish, many of the concerns being discussed today could disappear quickly. Success has a way of changing perceptions in professional football. When a team is winning and young players are developing into contributors, the conversation about philosophy tends to shift. People stop questioning the approach and start celebrating the results. But if familiar questions begin surfacing around player opportunities and development, the comparisons to previous situations will only become louder. Every decision will be re-examined. Every explanation will be analyzed for familiar patterns. The pressure that's already building will only intensify. That's why the next several months could become so important for how Stefanski's story in Atlanta actually unfolds. Here's the fundamental question hanging over Kevin Stefanski's time in Atlanta. Has he learned from the criticism that followed him in Cleveland, or are NFL fans about to watch the exact same debates unfold all over again? That's the question nobody can answer right now. Not because of a losing streak, not because of a controversy inside the locker room, not because of a major roster decision, but because a few innocent comments were enough to remind many fans of concerns they thought were left in the past. Both sides believe they understand what's coming. Supporters see a coach committed to building players the right way. Critics see a pattern they've witnessed before beginning again. The truth probably sits somewhere between those positions, but fans won't wait for nuance. They'll choose their side and watch closely for evidence that confirms it. What's certain is that the spotlight on Stefanski is now brighter than ever. Every decision will be analyzed. Every explanation will be scrutinized. Every move involving young players will become part of a narrative that's already being written. Atlanta's young talent is under a microscope, and as the season approaches, the pressure will only intensify. The next chapter of Stefanski's career is officially underway, and everyone's waiting to see whether it brings a fresh start or a familiar story.